let's talk about what's actually happening on their end right now. Because if you've been doing the work, if you've genuinely pulled back your energy, reduced your availability, stopped performing your life for their benefit, stopped reaching across the distance, then something is happening in them that you probably can't see from where you're standing. And I want to tell you exactly what that is. Not as a comfort, not as a "this will make them come back" promise, but because understanding the psychology of what your absence is doing to an avoidant is genuinely important information. It helps you understand what you're dealing with. It helps you make better decisions, and it helps you stop interpreting the silence on their end as nothing, when it is very often something. Your silence is not nothing to them, even if they're acting like it is, even if they've gone quiet in response, even if from the outside everything looks like they've moved on or that they don't care. Here's what's actually happening underneath all of that. How avoidants process absence. Before we get into what your silence is doing to them, you need to understand something fundamental about how avoidants process the absence of someone who matters to them. Avoidants are not emotionally disconnected people. I know that's what the distance can make it seem like. I know that the walls and the withdrawal and the hot and cold and the way they can go from warm to cold seemingly overnight, all of that can start to make you wonder if they feel anything at all. But that is not what's happening. Avoidants feel deeply, often more deeply than they're comfortable with, which is in large part why the walls exist in the first place. What they are is emotionally delayed and emotionally suppressed. Their whole system is wired to minimize, contain, and manage emotional experience, rather than to sit with it. So when something happens that would cause a secure person to immediately feel a strong emotion and respond to it, an avoidant's first response is often to shut down, to deactivate, to go quiet, to function on autopilot while the emotion gets processed somewhere below the surface, somewhere they don't have to look at it directly. This means that when you disappear, when you go quiet, when you withdraw your energy, when you stop being a consistent presence in their periphery, the impact of that absence doesn't always register immediately. Their system often doesn't let it. Their defense mechanisms were built precisely for this, to prevent the full weight of something emotionally significant from landing all at once, to buffer them from the discomfort of needing someone who isn't there. So the first phase can look like nothing. They seem fine. They seem unbothered. They might even seem relieved. And if you're watching from the outside, if you're monitoring their social media or listening to mutual friends, that apparent ease can feel like a gut punch, like confirmation that you never mattered as much as you thought. But then the suppression starts to leak. And that's when things get interesting. And here's what I want you to understand before we get into the phases. This is not theoretical. This is not wishful thinking dressed up in psychological language. The research on avoidant attachment consistently shows that avoidants experience emotional responses to loss that are just as intense as what anxious attachment styles feel. They are simply better at suppressing the visible expression of those responses. The pain is real. The processing just looks different from the outside. And because it looks different, because it doesn't announce itself the way anxious pain does, it is very easy to mistake avoidant pain for avoidant indifference. They are not the same thing. And the more clearly you understand the difference, the less power the silence on their end has to make you doubt what your silence is doing. Phase 1. The deactivation. When you go quiet, the avoidant's initial response is almost always to deactivate further, to pull inward, to tell themselves, consciously or not, that this is fine, that space is actually what they needed, that things were getting too intense anyway. This is their system doing exactly what it's always done, using distance as self-regulation. When something threatens emotional stability, they create space. And your withdrawal? Initially, it reads to their system as permission to create more space without the friction of your continued pursuit. So they lean into it. They do. During this phase, they probably don't reach out. They probably seem fine from the outside. They probably go about their life without any visible disruption. Work, gym, friends, the same routines, carrying on. Nothing on the surface to suggest that anything has shifted. And this is the phase where a lot of people break, where the absence of any visible reaction feels like confirmation that they don't care. Where the urge to reach back out, to do something, anything, to get a reaction, to prove that your absence actually means something, becomes almost unbearable. Where you start to think, okay, maybe I had this wrong. Maybe they really are fine. Maybe it really was always about me needing more than they needed to give. Don't break here, because this phase is not the end of the story. This is just their defense system doing its job. It's the part they're good at, the part they've been doing their whole lives. And what comes next is what actually tells you something true about where they are and what you meant to them. There's something important that happens in this first phase that most people miss. Because the avoidant is in deactivation, their conscious mind will often produce a narrative to support that deactivation. They tell themselves things. They remind themselves of everything that was complicated about the dynamic. They remember the moments of friction, the times things felt like too much, the ways the connection made them feel confined or overwhelmed or stretched past what felt comfortable. They are, in effect, building a case for why the distance is fine, for why they're better off here. And if you could hear their inner monologue in this phase, you'd probably find it frustrating, because it would sound cold and closed and almost deliberately indifferent. But here's the thing about that case they're building. They're only building it because they need it. You don't need an argument for why you're fine if you're actually fine. You don't need to remind yourself of all the reasons distance is manageable if the distance isn't pulling at something in you. The case they're building in phase 1 is the first evidence that your absence has registered. They're just not there yet in their processing. They're still fighting it off. Phase 2, the restlessness. About a week in, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on the person and the depth of the connection, something shifts, quietly, beneath the surface. Without them having a name for it yet, the distraction techniques they've been using to stay in deactivation mode start to wear thin. The things they normally use to maintain emotional self-sufficiency, work, routine, social activity, other people, the general busyness of their life, start to feel slightly hollow in the specific spot where you used to be. Not hollow across the board, just in that one particular place. They notice your absence in a way they weren't expecting. Not dramatically, not in a way they'd necessarily admit to, even to themselves, but in the small, quiet moments. The moment they see something you'd have found funny and reach for their phone before remembering they haven't been talking to you. The moment they have a thought that they'd normally share with you and then sit with it alone instead. The moment they wake up and something feels slightly off without being able to immediately identify why. The person who was always there, always available, always oriented toward them, isn't as present. And that gap, small as it might seem, is registering in their system. It's landing somewhere even if they haven't consciously acknowledged it yet. This is restlessness. It's not crisis. It doesn't feel like pain yet. It just feels like a low-grade something that they can't quite locate or name. An itch they can't scratch. A static in the background. A sense that something that was reliable is no longer there to fall back on, and they didn't realize how much they were relying on it until it wasn't. Let that sit for a second. Because that's significant. You were something they were relying on. Even when they were pulling away. Even when they were creating distance. The warmth you were providing, the consistency you were showing up with, the emotional availability they were quietly drawing from, all of that was doing something in their world. And your absence is making that visible in a way the presence couldn't. And if you're wondering whether this is actually happening, if you're second guessing whether they could really be experiencing any of this, given how little it showed while you were there, I want to offer you something concrete. Research consistently shows that avoidants who have lost or distanced from someone they were close to often show increased activation in the parts of their nervous system associated with threat response during this phase. Not calm, not ease. Their physiological state is registering a threat. The problem is that their learned response to threat is to suppress rather than express. So you won't necessarily see it, but it's happening. The restlessness is real. The reaching for their phone and stopping themselves is real. The moments where the busyness of their life briefly clears and something that has your name on it surfaces, those are real. They just don't perform it the way someone with anxious attachment would. And because you're probably wired to look for the performance, for the evidence, for the overt signal, their silence in this phase can look like the absence of feeling when it's actually just the absence of expression. Phase 3. When the pain actually lands. Here's where it gets real. If your absence continues, if you don't break the silence and hand them the relief of your return, that restlessness starts to compound. It doesn't stay at a low hum. It builds. The gap you've created doesn't fill itself. Their normal coping mechanisms don't fully address it, because the specific warmth and presence you provided is not something they can produce internally. They can distract, they can stay busy, they can tell themselves they're fine. But the gap remains. And slowly, without their permission, something that functions like pain begins to emerge. Not the same kind of pain you've been feeling, not the anxious, hypervigilant, overthinking kind of pain where you lie awake replaying conversations. Their pain tends to be quieter, more internal, more like a heaviness than a panic. It tends to show up in their body before it shows up in their conscious thoughts. A tension they can't quite locate, an irritability without an obvious source, a tiredness that sleep doesn't fix, a flatness to things that were fine before. It shows up as a creeping awareness that something they had, something they didn't fully value while they had it, is no longer guaranteed. That the option to come back to you, to re-engage on their own timeline, to pick things back up whenever they decided they were ready, that option is looking less certain than it once did. And for someone who has built their entire sense of emotional safety around always being the one who could leave, always being the one with one foot out the door, always being the one who cared slightly less, that shift in the dynamic is genuinely uncomfortable in a way they don't have a ready-made response to. Because here's the thing about avoidant attachment. Their whole system is designed to never let them be in a position where they are the one who wants more, where they are the one who is feeling the absence, where the power dynamic has reversed and they are the one on the outside of a distance they didn't create and can't quite control. Your silence puts them in that position, and they don't like it there. And something else is happening in phase 3 that I think is worth naming. For avoidance, a lot of their sense of relational safety comes from feeling like they are the one who is less invested, the one who needs less, the one who has less to lose. It's an equilibrium they've maintained, often unconsciously, in their relationships for most of their adult lives, maybe longer. And your presence, your availability, your warmth, your continued reaching toward them was actually part of what maintained that equilibrium. You being present made it easier for them to be less present. You being invested made it less risky for them to be only partially invested. When you remove yourself from that equation, the equilibrium breaks. Suddenly they are the one who is more present in their own thoughts, more aware of the gap, more conscious of what they had and may be losing. And that reversal, from being the one with the power to leave, to being the one who is sitting with the weight of having pushed someone away, is profoundly disorienting for someone whose entire attachment strategy was built to prevent exactly that. They don't know what to do with this position. It's unfamiliar. And that unfamiliarity is part of what makes this phase so significant. Why they don't come running immediately. Let me address something directly. Because a lot of people hear they're feeling pain and expect that to translate immediately into contact, into a meaningful conversation, into some kind of grand gesture. A text that finally says something real. A call where they show up in a way they've never shown up before. And sometimes it does, but often it doesn't happen that quickly or that simply. And understanding why is important, so you're not interpreting their continued silence as evidence that the pain isn't real. Avoidants who are in pain don't reach toward the source of the pain the way anxious attachment styles do. They don't immediately text, they don't call, they don't show up at your door with a revelation about everything they've been holding back. Their first response to emotional pain, like their first response to most things, is to manage it privately, to try to contain it, to see if they can make it smaller through willpower and time and distraction before they have to do anything that requires them to be vulnerable. So they'll keep going about their life, but something has changed in the quality of that going about. There's a weight to it now, a flatness in things that were fine before, an awareness of you, not obsessive, not consuming, but present, low and persistent, and hard to shake. Like background noise they've learned to function around but can't make stop. And eventually, not always but often, especially if the connection was real and the time they spent with you actually mattered, the management stops working as well as it used to. The containment starts to fail. The gap in the place where you were gets bigger rather than smaller, and they reach out. Sometimes obliquely, a meme, a random observation, something that seems casual but is actually a toe in the water. Sometimes with something that seems small on the surface but lands differently than small things usually do. And sometimes from avoidants who have been doing their own work or who are further along in their own reckoning with something direct, which, coming from an avoidant, is the emotional equivalent of a full declaration. But, and this is the part you need to hold on to, not all of them do. Not all avoidants, even ones who are genuinely feeling the absence, make the move across the distance they've created. Some of them feel the pain and choose, consciously or not, to stay in it rather than risk the vulnerability of reaching back towards someone who might not be there anymore, or might not receive them the way they hope. That's not nothing. That's still information. about where they are in their own growth, about what they're capable of right now, about whether what they can currently offer is actually enough for you. What the pain is not. Here's something I need you to hear clearly. Because it is easy to get the significance of this exactly wrong, the fact that they're feeling pain does not mean you should go back and relieve it. That might sound harsh. Hear me out. There is a version of this story where you realize they're suffering, you feel the compassion you've always felt for them, and you reach back, you soften, you restore the warmth, you hand them the relief of knowing you're still there, still available, still the consistent presence they've been quietly drawing from. And for a short time, maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks, things are warmer, get more engaged, more affectionate, more present. Things feel better. And then the pattern resets. Because nothing has fundamentally changed. Because the pain of your absence was not enough, on its own, to make them do the internal work that would actually change how they show up. And so you're back in the same dynamic you were in before, just having briefly experienced what it felt like to have them reach for you. Which, honestly, might make it harder, not easier, to hold your ground the next time. Because now you've tasted it. Now you know what it looks like when they try. And that knowledge makes the distance feel even more unbearable. Their pain is real. Your compassion for it is real. Both of those things can be true and still not be a reason to walk back into something that was consistently hurting you. Their discomfort at your absence is not your responsibility to manage. What you're waiting for, if you're waiting at all, is not evidence of pain. Pain without action changes nothing. What you're looking for is evidence of change. Evidence that the discomfort of your absence has prompted them to actually look at themselves. Evidence that something in them has shifted. Evidence that they're not just reaching back to reset the dynamic to comfortable, but reaching back with something genuinely new to offer. A different way of showing up. An acknowledgement of what wasn't working. A willingness to be in this differently than they were before. That distinction matters enormously. Don't confuse their pain with your answer. What this tells you about the connection. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. The fact that your absence is affecting them, the fact that your silence has weight, that the gap you've created is being felt rather than easily dismissed, that their coping mechanisms are straining against it, that tells you something about the connection, something real. It tells you that what you had wasn't nothing, that you existed in their world as more than just a convenient presence or a source of easy validation, that you were providing something, warmth, understanding, a specific kind of availability that their system valued even when they didn't say so, even when they were pulling away, even when the behavior suggested otherwise. That matters. It doesn't fix everything, it doesn't resolve the dynamic or tell you what to do next. But it matters, because some people go through avoidant dynamics and spend months afterward wondering whether any of it was real, whether they were ever truly seen, whether the person they gave so much of themselves to was ever genuinely affected by them, or whether they were just filling a role that could have been filled by anyone. Your silence is answering that question. The restlessness, the pain, the way they're moving towards you or struggling not to, all of that is the answer. All of that is the part they couldn't say directly when you were there. All of that is the truth of what you meant, showing up in the only language their system currently knows how to use. The connection was real. The feeling was real. What wasn't working was the pattern, and patterns can change. But only if both people are willing to choose something different than the thing that felt safe. Some of you need to hear that part again. The connection was real. I know the avoidance behavior has probably made you question that. The pulling away, the hot and cold, the way they could make you feel seen and then invisible within the span of days. I know those patterns can make the whole thing feel like a question mark. But the fact that your absence is registering in them the way it is, that is not the behavior of someone who never cared. That is the behavior of someone who cared and didn't know what to do with that caring. Who cared and responded to the discomfort of caring by creating distance rather than leaning in. That distinction matters. It doesn't resolve everything, it doesn't automatically make them right for you. But it does answer the question of whether it was real. It was real, you didn't imagine it, and you are not the only one sitting with what it was. What you do with all of this, so we get to the practical question, you understand what's happening on their end, you understand the phases, the pain, the pattern. What do you actually do with that knowledge? First, you don't use this to rush back in. The knowledge that they're hurting is not a reason to go relieve the hurt before they've done anything to change the conditions that created it. Their emotional process is theirs to move through. It's not your job to fast track it by making yourself available again before they've shown you something worth returning to. Second, you pay attention to what they do, not what they feel, not what you imagine is happening inside them, what they actually do, whether they reach out, whether they say something real when they do, whether there's evidence in their behavior, not just their words, that something has actually shifted in how they're willing to show up. Third, you stay grounded in your own life, because this awareness of their internal process can become its own kind of trap. Sitting with the knowledge that they're suffering and using it as a reason to stay mentally invested in what they're going through, instead of being fully present in your own experience. That's just a different form of being organized around them. And you have spent enough time organized around someone else's emotional state. Your life is happening right now. Put yourself back in it. And finally, you decide, not passively, not by default, not by waiting until circumstances force your hand or their behavior becomes undeniable enough to push you in one direction. You decide what you want. You decide what you're willing to step back into and under what conditions. You decide what would need to be different for this to be worth returning to. And you hold that line with the same steadiness you've been practicing in the silence. Because your silence, the real kind, the kind that comes from actually reclaiming your own life and your own energy and your own sense of what you deserve, is not a pause in the story. It is a statement about what you require, about what you're no longer willing to accept as normal, about the version of yourself you're becoming on the other side of this. And what you require is not too much. It never was. The last thing, you've been doing hard work, getting quiet, pulling your energy back, sitting with the discomfort of not knowing. All of that takes something real. And if you've done it genuinely, not just as a strategy to make them come back, but as an actual act of choosing yourself, you've changed something, not just in the dynamic. In yourself, the person who can hold their own silence, who can sit with the uncertainty without acting on the anxiety, who can let someone else feel the weight of their absence without rushing to relieve it, that person has something that is genuinely rare. A kind of steadiness that doesn't come from not caring. It comes from caring deeply and choosing yourself anyway. From knowing that you matter enough to hold your own ground. From deciding that what you bring to a relationship is worth someone showing up for, actually showing up for, and refusing to settle for less than that. Whatever comes next, whether they come back or they don't, whether this resolves the way you're hoping or it doesn't, whether they rise to meet the moment or stay in the avoidance, you're building something here that serves you far beyond this one situation. You are learning how to be the person who doesn't disappear when things get uncomfortable. Not from someone else's life, from your own. And that version of you, the one who knows how to hold the line, who doesn't crumble at the first sign of silence, who doesn't hand over their peace in exchange for someone else's comfort, that person is going to show up differently in every relationship that comes after this. They're going to ask for what they need. They're going to recognize when a dynamic is costing them more than it's giving them. They're going to trust the discomfort earlier and act on it sooner. And they are going to know in their bones, not just in their head, that their presence is something worth showing up for. That's not nothing, that is actually everything. Keep going. The silence is working. Even when it doesn't feel like it, even when the absence of visible reaction makes you question whether any of this is worth it, your silence is not nothing. It never was. The healing room is right here.